So I graded your guys' homework quizzes from last time, and it became clear to me that we're still kind of struggling with, or some of us are still kind of struggling with the notation involved for these intervals for domains and ranges and increasing, decreasing, and constant and all of that. And I thought a little bit about what I was seeing from you guys and if there was another way that we could kind of approach this process. And I think I have something that'll be a little bit more helpful in terms of the ways to kind of think about these domains and ranges and intervals, positive, negative, increasing, decreasing, constant, that I'd like to kind of show you guys, if that sounds okay to start with. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to start by talking about the domain. So the domain is all about the x-axis. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to just look at the start and end of my function, and I'm just going to capture that part of the x-axis. Is everybody okay with that? So on that x-axis, I'm just going to record the points that are relevant to my graph, and only the x-coordinates, because we're talking about the x-axis. So -6, then -3, -1, 0, 2, 4, 5, and then 6. Everybody okay with that? So, as I traverse along this graph, I have a point at -6, so I'll start with a filled-in circle on my number line. And as I go along my graph, I go all the way to -1, in which there's a hole in my graph. You see the hole on the graph? So I'm going to put an open circle on my number line, and then I continue traversing the graph all the way to the end. Everybody can kind of see that? So I'm going to use this number line now to write my interval for my domain. I'm going to ignore the graph and all the extra distracting information from the graph and just look at my number line. Is everybody okay with that? So if I look at my number line, I have one section that goes here and my second section that goes there. Everybody see that? There's a break in my number line where that open circle is. So I'm going to need to do two intervals. So the first interval starts at -6, and it ends at -1. The second interval starts at -1 and ends at 6. Everybody okay with that? Notice I wrote a filled-in circle at -6. So I'm going to write a bracket there. And I have an open circle at -1, so I'm going to put a parenthesis there. Likewise, when I look at my next interval, I have an open circle at -1 and a filled-in circle at +6. And I connect these with the union in the middle. Everybody okay with that? Okay? So this was the domain that we did. Now I'm going to do the intervals of positive, negative, 0, and then the intervals increasing, decreasing, and constant. Okay with that plan? In each of those settings, I'm going to start by just drawing my domain. I'm just going to carry about, or I'm only going to care about the segment of the number line that represents my domain. And I'm going to redraw this a bunch of times, so I'm just going to kind of like copy and paste it so I can do it a bunch of times. So the first thing that I'm going to do is maybe let's do the positive negative 0. Sound good? So I'm going to do positive first. So I'm going to go to my graph and look for the positive sections on my graph. That's the only positive section on my graph, correct? Because it's the only part of my graph above the x-axis. So that's going to go from 4 to 6. Everybody okay with that? Now the endpoints at 4 and 6, are those points above the x-axis if I look? No. So I'm going to draw those with an open circle. And that's the only part of my graph above the x-axis, correct? So my interval is just 4 to 6, with parentheses because I drew open circles at the ends. Let's do negative next. Sound good to you guys? So I'm going to go to my graph, and I'm going to identify the negative parts. So I have a negative part here. Notice that I'm stopping at the break in my graph. See the negative hole at -1 there? Then I'm going to have another negative part there. Notice I'm stopping because there's a 0 there at 0. The graph is on the x-axis. And then my last negative part is this piece here. Everybody agree with that? So if I go down to my number line, I'm starting at -6, and that point that has -6 is below the x-axis, so it should be included with the negative, so I'm going to draw a filled-in circle, and then I go all the way to -1. And then I go from -1 to 0. 0 was on the x-axis, so I'll draw an open circle there, and then I go all the way from 0 to 4. And 4 was on the x-axis, so draw an open circle there. Everybody okay with that? So if I'm writing my interval then, I have -6 to -1. Because I filled in the circle for -6, that gets a bracket. The -1 gets a parenthesis because there's an open circle there. My next interval goes from -1 to 0. -1 gets a parenthesis because it was an open circle, as does 0. And then I have one more interval that goes from 0 to 4. 0 got a parenthesis before, gets a parenthesis again, and then 4 gets a parenthesis as we drew an open circle there as well. And then if I wanted to do the 0, if I go back to my graph, the parts that are 0, 0, 4, 6, but nothing in between those, right? So that means that I can write this just using a set notation and list those 3 values, since there was nothing in between those values. Does that feel okay there? Does this feel like a little bit more organized of a way to look at writing these intervals? I'm hoping that when we get rid of all the y coordinates in there, it becomes a little less confusing, and you have a way to kind of just focus on the one part of the graph that you care about rather than having to look at the whole thing over and over and over again. If you just look at the number line that we write, it's really easy to write the intervals from it. And it should be not so bad writing drawing the number line from the graph, but going graph to interval, it looked like was giving us some problems because I looked at people with the right idea, but the notation got all kind of goobered up halfway through. And hopefully this feels a little bit more organized. Let's continue. We have increasing, decreasing constant still to talk about. So the increasing part, I'm going to go back and look at my picture. And I'm going to erase all my marks out of there. So increasing, I have one section here to here. Notice that I stopped because of the break. And then I have one section there to there. And then I have one section from here to here. Everybody agree with that? I have three little increasing sections. So I'll go down to my number line. I went from -3, to -1. And remember when we did the increasing, decreasing constant parts, the endpoints are really going to always be parentheses, so they're just all going to be open circles. Because at the end, at a single point, you're not going up or downhill, it's just a point. Like you can't talk about the slope for just a point. And then from -1 to 0, and then from 2 to 5. So I have -3 to -1, -1 to 0, and then 2 to 5. Everybody okay with that? For the decreasings, go back and look at my graph. So decreasing, I have this section here from 0 to 2, and this section here from 5 to 6. Again, we said all of these transition points should be open circles. So I have 0 to 2 and 5 to 6. And remember, open circle means parenthesis. So I use parentheses on all those. And then the constant, I'm going to do in the purple. So I'll go back and I'll look at my graph one last time. And I notice that I have this flat section here that goes from -6 to -3. And again, we know the endpoints here are, oops, didn't go down far enough. Jeepers creepers. -6 to -3. And the endpoints on these increasing, decreasing constants are always parentheses. Does that feel a little bit easier to deal with? We still need to talk about the range. The range, I'm going to do the same kind of thing, but I'm going to do it on the graph. So I'm going to go back and scroll up and look at the graph. Is anybody still writing any of these number lines that needs me to pause for a moment? Or go back to any of the number lines if they were trying to copy something down and I went a little too fast? Again, if I get carried away and go too fast for you, please let me know, and I'm happy to slow down. So I'm going to erase all this stuff. So for the range, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this graph just as two halves. So I'm going to look at this half of the graph first. So if I look at the range, we're talking about the y-coordinates. So where I'm going to do my drawing is going to be on the y-axis. So if I start at the beginning, my y-coordinate is at -3. and it's actually a y-coordinate on a point, so I'm going to fill in a circle there. And then from -3, I go up to here to -1. And then there's the break in my graph, so I'll draw an open circle there. And then I go all the way up to 0. Everybody okay with that first half? I'm then going to do the same thing on the second half of the graph. So here I'm starting at 0. That's actually a point in my graph, so I'll fill that in. And I go all the way down to -4. That's actually a point in my graph, so I did that run. And then I go from -4 all the way up to positive 0.5. So I'm starting at -4, going all the way back up to positive 0.5. And then I finish off by going back down to 0. Everybody okay there with what I did? I just kind of drew up and down the y-axis as I traversed along the graph, right? Notice that when I did that, I tracked over the filled-in circle. Did you guys notice when I drew over the open circle that I drew initially? By drawing over that open circle, I've really filled that in. So if I track back across a gap when I'm doing this, that fills in the gap. Is everybody okay with that? So if I look at this, my range begins at -4 and it ends at positive 0.5. And those are both filled in circles, so they both get brackets. Does that feel okay?